Five, four, three, two, one.
Bill Kopp is a veteran music journalist. His work can be viewed on his amazing website, musicoscribe.com, and also on Blurt Magazine. His upcoming book, Reinventing Pink Floyd, which follows the path taken by the remaining band members following the departure of Sid Barrett, is set to be released February 15, 2018. And here joining us to talk a little bit about the book, I bring you Bill Kopp.
Hey, Danny, how's it going?
It's going pretty good. How's it going on your end?
Fantastic. Can you hear me okay?
Oh, yes, I can hear you good, Bill. Well, let's jump right on into it. Can I start by asking you what inspired you to write the book?
Well, I've been a fan of Pink Floyd's music since I was a kid. I mean, way back, back in the 70s. And I just, as I kind of just spent my time discovering their catalog over the years, I kind of realized that there's a whole lot of stuff that people don't know. Most people are very, very familiar with Dark Side of the Moon and then everything forward. And then there's a kind of a smaller subset of people that know about The Piper at the Gates of Dawn, the first album from 1967. But what I discovered just over the years, just talking to different people, is that not many people know that there were a whole bunch of projects in between the 67 album and Dark Side of the Moon in 72. And so I thought it would be interesting to explore that era. And so that's kind of the inspiration for the book.
Where did you start? Where did you go first? I know you say you spoke with a few people. I seen that Jerry wrote the foreword. Where did you?
Right.
Yeah.
The first thing I did, excuse me. The first thing I did was, quite honestly, is I went back and started listening to the albums, start to finish in order,
right,
just to kind of sort of set the scene. And then what I did is I started digging through archives and finding reviews that were written about those records, not written now, but things that were written at the time that they came out.
Mm-hmm.
So, a review of, say, Umaguma, written in 1969, when they couldn't compare it to Dark Side of the Moon or The Wall or anything like that, because those things didn't exist yet.
Mm-hmm.
So I went back and these aren't things that you can just find on the internet. I dig a whole lot deeper.
Right.
But so I went back and I found a lot of those reviews. I found interviews with the band, because in those days they did do interviews. By the time they got really big, they all but quit doing interviews.
Right.
So I was able to find a whole lot of information there, and then from there I just began to think, okay, well, the story of the band as I know it, I knew it involved a number of other characters, and so I began to reach out to some of those people to see if they would talk to me, and quite a few of them did.
Okay. And did you let them know that you had the idea of the book as such?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Absolutely. For everyone that I interviewed, the first thing I did was, obviously I sort of introduced myself to them, because I didn't know any of them ahead of my interviewing them.
Okay.
So when I first reached out, I explained who I was, explained the premise of the book, where I'm going with it.
Right.
In fact, that brings up an interesting point. When it came to talking to people who had worked closely with Sid Barrett, some of them, Jerry Shirley, for example, were initially quite reluctant to talk, because in his experience, and I don't want to put words in his mouth, but he's had concerns that, he's read other books about Pink Floyd and seen that a lot of writers, or at least some writers, focus on, Sid's drug use and his erratic behavior and all that, as opposed to the music. And he really didn't want any part of that. Essentially his idea was he didn't really want to open up about working with his friend if it was just going to be, if I was some sort of reporter trying to dig up dirt. My interest is from the entire project was the music. It was the idea that, as I say in the book, not in these exact words, but, when the band started out, Sid Barrett was the leading light. He was the face of the band. He was the guitarist. He wrote nearly all the songs. He sang nearly all the songs. So when he was gone, they almost had to start from scratch. I mean, sure, they got an amazing guitarist in David Gilmour, but Gilmour had never written a song to that point. So they had to sort of regroup. And the fact that within 5 years of that, they had released, arguably the greatest or one of the greatest albums of the rock era. I thought, that's a story worth investigating. And so once I explained that to the people that I wanted to talk to, they opened up. A number of interesting things came out, which I wasn't even expecting. I reached out to Steve Howe, who most people, of course, know as the guitarist in Yes.
Right.
Back in 1967, he was in a group called Tomorrow, who they had that really big hit in the UK, My White Bicycle.
Okay.
So I reached out to Steve because I know I'm close to people who are close to him. So I got in touch with Steve mainly because I knew that Tomorrow had shared a bill with Pink Floyd back in '67. So my interest was just in sort of on background in general. Hey, what was it like being on a bill with Pink Floyd in those days? What were your impressions of the band? What happened, though, is he told me a story that, to my knowledge, he's never shared before, and that is that in late 1967, when Sid Barrett was starting to get erratic and not show up for gigs and things, the band and the management asked Steve to fill in for Sid one night at a concert.
Right.
To take his place.
Right.
And at the last minute, Sid showed up, and it didn't happen. But that's a story that Steve hasn't had told before, to my knowledge.
And that's in the book.
And so, there's also another guitarist, Davey O'List, who was in a band called The Nice with Keith Emerson. They also shared a bill a number of times with Pink Floyd, and he actually did fill in for Sid Barrett one night.
Right.
When Sid just in Liverpool. That was I don't have the date in front of me, but that was late 1967. It was a show they did in Liverpool, England, and Sid wandered off, and so Davey O'List filled in for him.
How hard do you believe it was for them to actually get past what was happening at that time?
I don't know that they really thought of it in terms of difficulty. It was sort of, they had a record deal, and they had gigs booked, and they had done, Waters and Wright had done a little bit of songwriting. So I don't think there was ever a question of not continuing.
Right.
I mean, nothing that I came up with suggested that they ever thought of throwing in the towel or anything like that. But I think they just sort of went forward, and what they really did was they would just try a bunch of different experimental things. The post Sid Barrett Pink Floyd sounds very, very different from the first album. I mean, Saucer Full of Secrets, other than the couple of tracks that Sid is on, that music is very, very different because it was a product of different writers, And so, but I don't know that it was difficult. I think they would just sort of, for lack of a better expression, if they came up with an idea, they'd throw everything against the wall and see what sticks. Some things worked, and then they would build on those successes, and some things didn't, and they'd sort of leave those ideas behind. And I think they just spent the better part of those 5 years finding their way, developing their voice, developing their new musical personality, and in the studio and live on stage, sort of finding their way of what worked.
I was just wondering, how the balance in just rehearsal, for example, would be before a show. How the backstage would be. Did you get into that in the book?
You mean with Davey O'List when he filled in?
Right.
Well, that's a very good question, and I asked about that, and the answer is there was no rehearsal.
Oh.
There was none. And both Steve Howe had said the same thing. He said, because I asked him, I said, well,
Right.
what were you going to do? And so he and Davey essentially said the same thing, that they had both seen the band enough times that they had a pretty good idea of how the stuff went. In fact, Davey O'List made the point that because these were showcase gigs that they were doing where there'd be 5 or 6 bands, and each group would only get 20 minutes on stage, whether it was The Move or, Graham Bond Organization or whoever the bands were. Their sets were 20 minutes long. And so when the Nice would finish their set, Davey O'List would go out into the audience and he would watch Pink Floyd. And he said he watched them every chance he got. So he was a big, big fan. So he knew the songs. He was familiar with the material. Now, the way he was going to play it was very, very different from the way that Sid would play. But, he knew, okay, this is the space where my guitar goes, and so I'll play during that. I'll play my way. But these are it goes here and it doesn't go there. But there was no rehearsal at all.
Yeah, that's what I was kind of seeing. It has to be a shifter in energy for those guys. It had to be, and I was just wondering.
I'm sure it threw them off balance,
right.
as it does with any band. When if you're used to having, when you have to replace any musician at a moment's notice, and especially if it's someone like Sid Barrett, whose sound was so central
right.
to what they were doing.
Right. And
but they managed. They had no choice. I mean, they couldn't go, hey, we can't play tonight. Our guitarist isn't here. That was never considered as an option. They had to get somebody.
And then, as you said, from a fan or listeners in the crowd's perspective, knowing who you're going to see on stage sometimes can be a shift in energy. And I was wondering if they covered that also.
Actually they did, because and Davey O'List was telling me he was backstage with Roger and Rick and Nick before going on, and he said, well, the thing is, the fans are going to recognize me. They're going to be upset.
Yeah.
They want to see Sid, and they don't. Davey O'List didn't look like Sid, and they said, don't worry about that at all. Sid a lot of times wears this big floppy hat. Here, you wear the hat and pull it down over your face. No one will even notice. So he sounded different, but he said that no, their 20-minute set, no one noticed. I don't know this for a fact, but I know that because Pink Floyd was using a lot of lights and things. If you've seen any films at all of the Sid era band, they were playing under colored lights and oil projections and a lot of shadows. So the fact that the audience wouldn't have been able to see Davey's face makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
So that's how he got away with it.
When they're recording and building, I guess you could say, rebuilding confidence and security as far as knowing who's going to be there every night.
Mm-hmm.
Did they move into that field? Did you speak to people as far as once they knew consistency would somewhat be there?
Well, yeah. I mean, when they were, they worked as one of the interesting things to me was that in that period, once Sid was gone, because it's sort of you talk about the sort of the, I don't want to say, not about power, but the balance
right.
of the band shifted, and with Sid gone, it became, to my way of thinking, a more democratic band, a more evenly distributed band in terms of who did what.
Roles, right.
And so, yeah, right, the roles that they had. So I would say from 68 until the very, very early 70s, the band was the most a band of equals or relative equals that it was during any
balance,
other,
right? Balance,
more so than any other time. Yeah, balance, exactly. That would change a bit after Dark Side of the Moon, a period that I don't really get into too much in the book. The book focuses on up to Dark Side of the Moon.
Right?
I just right. But during that period, Nick Mason, for example, 68 to 73, 72 rather, Nick Mason was in many ways the sort of sonic architect. A lot of the sound effects kind of things, a lot of the, like the first song on Dark Side of the Moon, is almost all sound effects, and a lot of it's done with the VCS3 synthesizer. And so Mason was deeply involved in a lot of that with the tracks Speak to Me and On the Run. But if you go back a couple albums to something like a track on Adam Hart Mother called Alan's Psychedelic Breakfast, Nick Mason was deeply involved in that. So more than just being a drummer, I mean, he wasn't a songwriter, and he would never claim to be a songwriter. But in addition to being a drummer, he was in many ways the sort of sonic architect of a lot of the band's soundscapes.
Did you get a chance to speak with him?
You know, I reached out to Nick, and he wasn't available because at the time that I was doing the research for the book, he was deeply involved in the Victoria and Albert exhibition of Pink Floyd memorabilia called Their Mortal Remains. Oh. He was very involved in that, so he regretfully declined.
Why don't you go ahead and provide your social media accounts, and so how people can kind of get in contact with you and purchase the book?
Well, the book, which it'll be available for purchase on February 15 of next year, which is only about 8 weeks away. But it's available for pre-order right now. And if you visit reinventingpinkfloyd.com, there's a page on there that has pre-order information. And I mean, obviously, it's available from the big box places like pre-order from Barnes & Noble and Amazon and so forth. But if you go to the website and order it directly from the publisher, there's a Reinventing Pink Floyd Facebook page where I post alerts when I'm adding new stuff to the website, and I've been posting not super regularly, but as we get closer to the publishing date, I'll be publishing more and more stuff there, and I'm going to be adding exclusive content to the website. I've got I'll just have additional excerpts because that's the people who I interviewed. They were all very generous with their time, and then you talk about editing when you get into writing the book. Sometimes only a fraction of what they said ends up in the book. Right. So there's a lot of really good material because I had a target of how many words the book needed to be, so I couldn't just go on and on and on. But there's a lot of great material that didn't make it into the book, and so I'm going to be posting bits of interviews. In fact, I've got an interview with Davey O'List is on the website right now. Oh, wow. And that has a lot of content that's not in the book as well. So I'll be adding more. I'll probably add some content from my Steve Howe interview, maybe some things from my interview with Robin Hitchcock, because he was a big fan of Syd Barrett. Ron Geeson, who collaborated with Roger Waters and then was collaborated with the whole band on Adam Hart Mother, and Peter Jenner, who was the band's original manager. So there's a lot of content, and then quite a few other people as well, but there's a lot of material. Yeah,
you never thought of a 2-part book?
I was so deep into the project that I didn't really think beyond it as far as a part 2. I guess that's a possibility. I have a whole bunch of other book ideas that are knocking around in my head, and I hope to develop proposals for those in the next few months.
So that's going to do it for today's show. Once again, I want to thank you, Bill, for taking the time out to speak with us. For more information, head on over to www.itseasybreezy.com. Once again, that's www.itseasybreezy.com.